Welcome to the Chess Angle. This is not your typical chess podcast. If you're an amateur or club-level player, the Chess Angle is for you. Our content is aimed at busy adults who are serious about the game but have limited study time. Featured guests include both amateur and titled players alike. And now, here's your host, Director of the Long Island Chess Club, Neil Bellon.
Welcome, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Couple of interesting things at the club this week. I want to start by talking about my game. So my opponent was rated about 1,200. I was paired down the last two rounds. I had a bit of a slow start. This was a 6-round event. I won the first game, but then I had to take a bye in round 2. I lost round 3, so I was going into round 4 with only 1.5 points. But anyhow, my opponent did something which at that level is very common, and it's amazing how often this happens, and it's a major flaw in many people's games, especially at this level. And here's what happened. I moved a pawn to attack his knight because I wanted his knight to move because that square was covering a square that my queen could go on, which was on a long diagonal pointed towards my opponent's king. So I moved the pawn to kick his knight back, and the correct move, all he had to do was move the knight to safety. And I will say this, and I feel like this is like a deep, dark secret, even though it shouldn't be. 90% of the time, if somebody attacks one of your pieces, moving it to safety or trading it for a piece of equal value is generally going to be correct. But what happens is we do these puzzles and read these books about all these in-between moves, right? Ooh, I need to find an in-between move, or I need to find a shaka, right? Most of the time, that's not going to happen. All he had to do was move the knight, but what he did instead was he counterattacked my own knight on the other side of the board. So I push a pawn to kick his knight back, and then he attacks my knight, and it was a mistake. And the problem is, many people make those moves without analyzing. They say, well, you attack me, I'm going to attack you, but you have to really visualize what the position is going to look like when everything's traded and it comes out in the wash. So what happened, just to rewind this a little bit, I push a pawn to attack his knight, and he does the same to my knight on the other side of the board. So I go pawn takes knight, he does pawn takes knight, I take his pawn, he takes my pawn. But what happens is, after he takes my pawn, he has these two very weak, isolated doubled pawns on the A file, but yet his king side is a little bit messed up now because of the pawn that I took, and my pieces are active, his pawn structure is shot, and I was clearly winning at that point. So when you have a piece that's attacked, yes, there might be times where a counterattack is correct, but you need to really make sure that that's the case, and don't just sort of mindlessly counterattack. You really need to look at it, and I'm going to repeat what I said earlier. 90% of the time, the correct idea when a piece is attacked is just to move it to safety or to trade it for a piece of equal value. You'd be surprised how often that's correct. Now, later in this same game, something else came up, and this is sort of a time management thing. Now, remember, when you're playing at the club level, the time controls are much quicker than these major weekend tournaments. So this was a game 90. Our control is game 90, delay 10. Now, that's a lot of time, but at the same time, it does go quickly. And here's the thing, with a game 90, any of those club time controls like game 90, game 75, even if there's a delay, you can't be taking 12, 15 minutes on one move because you're going to get in time pressure. We spoke a little bit about that last week, how a friend of mine took 25 minutes on one move. But I did something that shows the correct way to manage time in these club controls. And believe me, very often I mess this up myself. But here's what happened. Against my opponent, I saw this possible exchange sack tactic. It was basically a thing where I go rook takes bishop, and then after the trades, I end up winning 2 pawns for the exchange with a much better position as well. I have a little bit of an attack, and I saw this rook take bishop, and I'm looking at it, and something's telling me it's correct, but I couldn't quite calculate it through. I wasn't 100% confident that it worked. So rather than waste like 15 minutes and then get myself into time pressure, I said, okay, I'm not quite seeing it. Let me move on. And the move I played, it turns out, was like the third best in the engine. And that was very smart. So I only took a few minutes on my clock and I accepted the fact that, okay, this is a game 90. I can't analyze the way I would in like a 40 move and 2-hour game. And that's how you handle a club time control. You have to accept that with these quicker club time controls, the games are going to be a little bit messier. They're not going to be quite as, I don't want to say perfect, but not quite as clean as some of the other games. You just simply can't take the time for deep calculation the way you can in other games. So club level games by definition are going to be a little bit messy. So that was a smart choice I made. Now, of course, when I put it in the engine, the exchange sack that I saw was correct. So I'm not beating myself up too much because at least I saw it. If I didn't even consider that, if I didn't even see that was a possibility, if I missed it completely, that would have really bothered me. But that's something to keep in mind with these club level time controls. There was another game this week. This was Tim Mirabile, who was on the podcast a few weeks ago. He's a master, and he was black against a young kid that comes to the club. He's rated about 1850. So 1850 versus a 2200, two very strong club players. And what happened there is something I've said about 100 times on the show, which is that at the amateur level, when it comes to tactics and when a tactical shot appears, simple, straightforward tactics like those 1 to 3 move sequences, those are going to appear much more often than complicated ones. Those really difficult, like 7-8 move sequences. And this is even with higher rated players. Basic tactics is generally all you need for the club level. And it happens all the time. And this is, again, even with higher rated club players. So basically what happened was this was a late middle game and it was a very simple pawn tactic. Tim could take a pawn with his knight. He sacrifices his knight. So he goes knight takes pawn. His opponent goes knight takes knight. But then Tim had a check with his queen. And then when he moves his king, he just takes his knight. So it was a very simple 3-move sequence. And that happens all the time. These are the things you need to see. So again, it was knight takes pawn, knight takes knight. So he temporarily sacked a knight for a pawn. But then he goes queen check. And then when his king moves, he then grabs the knight. So it was a queen forking check. Happens all the time. Basic tactics is going to appear more often than these complicated ones. Happens all the time. And then the final thing I want to talk about was a game between a 1630 player who's about a little over 1600 against an 1850 player. Very interesting. So what happened was they're in a knight and pawn endgame. The higher rated player was in time pressure, and he was clearly a little bit agitated from that. We could see it. But what happened was the lower rated player who had more time, he offered a draw in a somewhat unclear knight and pawn endgame. Witnessing this game, I'm wondering if he should have played on because A, the position wasn't clear, and B, his higher rated opponent, who was in major time pressure, was clearly nervous and uncomfortable. So there was a chance he could have made a mistake. So I'm wondering if the lower rated player, the 1630, had pressed on, if he would have won because it wasn't clear and he would just kind of wait for a blunder. But I think what happened was because it was such a difficult game, I think the 1630 was just happy with a draw. He just kind of wanted to be done with it. One thing I'll say there, and this is very, very true. I can tell you from running a club and just playing myself, it's always easy to say woulda, coulda, shoulda, and what the right move is when it's someone else's game, right? We're all grandmasters when we're standing there watching, right? We all know the right move. It's always easy when it's not your game. So you have to keep that in mind. But just an interesting psychological thing. I guess maybe for myself, I wanted the 1630 to play on because I was curious how that was going to play out. So some very interesting insights from the club this week. And now let's jump into our listener mailbag.
You've got mail.
Our first message is from @physics2112 from YouTube, and he says, like or dislike, I'm loving the club anecdotes to open the episodes. On the topic of grinding out endgames, both my tournament games last week ended in draws, despite me having a meaningful advantage according to the engine. My problem is that psychologically, if I ever feel my position is worse in the course of a game, at that moment, all I want is to avoid a loss. And even when my opponent blunders the advantage back to me, I've already lost the attacking mindset and consider the draw a win. It's possible I have a risk-averse personality, and it manifests in my games by looking for how to settle rather than how to win. Well, thanks so much for the comment. Very, very interesting. Now, the first thing you said about using club anecdotes to open the episodes, I agree with you there. I don't want to speak in absolutes, but I think that's going to be a keeper, using stories from the club as the cold open to the show. I seem to like it as well. Others do, so I appreciate the feedback. Now, what you described about being happy with the draw because you were worse for a lot of the game, there's something we've spoken about called loss aversion, and this isn't just a chess thing. This is for any type of competitive endeavor. Loss aversion is the idea that the pain of losing, the emotion of losing, is a more intense feeling than the thrill of winning. The joy you get in winning, that's actually a less powerful emotion than the pain of losing, and so we just don't want to lose. But I'm going to say this, because I've gone through this myself when I've played in tournaments. You have to understand at the amateur level, this happens all the time, where your opponent is beating up on you the whole game. He can win it a zillion ways. He has 6 ways till Sunday where he can win the game. He's just beating you up. You're debating if you are even doing the right thing playing on, like, should I resign already? And then at the drop of a hat, boom, he or she makes a blunder and the game completely turns around and you're winning. Now, when that happens, I think this is what you're describing. It sounds like you're sort of like getting nervous and you were just so annoyed with yourself that you were worse the whole game. You just want to seize on this opportunity to not lose. So you're just happy with the draw, but you need to lose that attitude because you're leaving a lot of rating points on the table. So what I do when that happens, if you're getting beat up the whole game and then he blunders and now you're completely winning, you need to step away from it because you have to shift your mindset. So you need to just walk away, get a glass of water, whatever, and say, okay, I'm winning now, and just walk back to the board with a fresh mindset. And whatever happened already, it's a sunk cost at this point. Whatever happened already doesn't matter. You're now winning, and you definitely have to go for the full point there because, as I said, you're going to be leaving a lot of rating points on the table, and that's really how you win games a good majority of the time at this level. You know, you could have been worse, even it really doesn't matter, but if your opponent makes a double question mark blunder and you're now winning, you have to jump on that. So hopefully you can turn that around. But if you're having trouble shifting the mindset to, I was losing this game, but now I'm winning, step away from the board, shake it off, look out the window, whatever, and then come back. And then you just go on to win the game. All right. But thanks for the comment. Our next message via email is from Nate. He says, hello, Neil. I recently happened upon your podcast and have enjoyed it. I am an adult beginner in my 40s, and I recently signed up at chess.com. Do you have a specific episode where you offer a few, say 3 books to help adults get started on their journey? Thanks for your time. Regards, Nate. Well, thanks for chiming in, Nate. I appreciate it. So if you're just starting out as far as books, I mean, there's plenty of things online, videos and courses and lessons. But as far as books, I would recommend the classic Bobby Fischer Teaches Chess. That's an OG book for beginners. I remember when I was younger, taking that out of the library. That was back in the day when people actually went to the library. I guess they still do today, but I feel like when I was younger, that was more of a thing. Anyhow, a more modern version of that book is the new Levy-Rozman book. Well, I'm calling it new. I mean, it's been out, a year or two maybe, which is How to Win at Chess. I haven't read the Levy-Rozman book, but by all accounts, it's supposed to be excellent. And as I said, many people are referring to the Rozman book as a more modern version of Bobby Fischer Teaches Chess. So those two will get you started. Now, as you get more experience, I wouldn't jump into this too early, but once you start playing and you get a little bit more competent as a player, then I would definitely recommend The Amateur's Mind by Jeremy Silman. That will really give you a foundation for the middle game and overall understanding in general about a lot of chess principles. That's for me, and people know this, that's the most important chess book, I believe. But that's going to come a little bit later. Again, if you're just starting out, I wouldn't get The Amateur's Mind too early. I would wait a bit. but best of luck with your journey and thanks for your email. We're now going to take a short break and we'll be back to continue our listener mailbag in just a moment. Our final message is from Aryan. He says, "Hey Neil, first of all, I really love the podcast and all the effort you put into it. I am a 13-year-old listener from Mumbai, India, and I just wanted to ask 3 small questions. Number 1, being a struggling player under 1,000 ELO in online chess, but playing well against 1,000 plus, specifically 1,000 to 1,400 rated players, how can I have more consistent positive results against them? Number 2, what would you recommend to practice for an upcoming FIDE-rated tournament in my city to beat opponents and stand a chance at winning and also growing as a player as a whole? And number 3, which one is better, puzzles or matches for learners' growth? Once again, I really love and enjoy the podcast. You've given chess players like me insightful listening content to grow my skills and to better play, enjoy, and learn the beautiful game. Regards, Aryan." Well, Aryan, thanks so much for the kind words. And even though this podcast is quote unquote about adult improvement, we do have a number of kids your age and younger who listen regularly, which is fantastic. And that's really what this is about. You know, we say it's for adults, but it's really a general audience podcast. So I really appreciate that you listen to the show. Now let's take your 3 questions one at a time. So you say you're a struggling player under 1,000 online, but you're beating 1,000 and 1,400 rated players. How can I have more consistent positive results? Well, here's the thing. With all these questions in general, I'm just going to give you generic answers because without working with you or seeing your games or giving a lesson to you or something like that, it's kind of hard because this is going to vary from person to person. So again, I'm going to speak in just very general terms. As far as more consistency, that's just going to come with experience. I know that sounds like not a lame answer. I mean, I know that sounds almost a little too generic, but that's really what it's about. You just have to play, analyze your games, and as you do it over time, the consistency will happen. All right, so just keep playing, just keep at it, and be patient. Now, number 2, you asked what would I recommend for you to practice for an upcoming tournament to beat opponents and to grow as a player? Well, a couple of things, not necessarily in order. I would make sure your openings are set. What I mean by that, know exactly what you're going to open with as white and how you're going to respond as black to the most common openings by white. So in other words, for the black pieces, know how you're going to respond to D4 or E4 or C4. And for white, know what you're going to play. You're going to open with E4, D4, because what a lot of players in your situation do is they go to a tournament and let's say they have the black pieces, their opponent opens with 1 D4 and they're scratching their head deciding what to play. You need to know before you even travel to the tournament exactly what your openings are going to be. So I would start with that and just keep playing and studying. Other than that, I don't really think it's anything too complicated. Also, little practical things. Make sure you get a good night's sleep the night before. I would not play like speed chess right before the round or do a whole bunch of puzzles that day. Even the night before, like once you get to the day before the tournament, I would just not do anything chess related and just relax and go in there fresh. All right. And make sure you enjoy it as well. You know, you want to have fun, but that's what I would recommend. Now, number 3, you say which one is better, puzzles or matches for learners' growth? Well, again, this is going to vary from person to person, but the answer is you need both. You need to study and you need to play. And at your level, I would recommend playing as much as possible. I don't think it's correct to say you should do more puzzles than playing or more playing than puzzles. It really is both. You need to study and you need to play. And as you do it, hopefully things will click. But Aryan, thanks so much for your email. And I wish you the best of luck in your upcoming tournament. All right. So for our main content this week, I am going to be responding to an interesting article I read on chess.com by National Master Jeremy Kane, and it's called Chess Openings in the Engine Era. I'll link it up in the show notes, of course, and it's about just that, how to deal with openings and opening preparation in the era of engines, where the engine basically says that most main lines should end up in a draw with perfect play. Now, the article, at least this is my perception, it tends to be focused more on what the pros are doing and how they're handling openings. But I'm going to look at this from more of an amateur point of view, because I do think this is applicable even at our level. So I'm going to start by reading the first 2 or 3 paragraphs. It's not too long, just to give some context. And then we're going to look at these 5 opening strategies or ideas that he discusses. So again, it's called Chess Openings in the Engine Era. Here are the first 3 paragraphs. He says, former world champion GM Magnus Carlsen recently lamented that it's quote unquote kind of sad to see how far you have to go to get a game, that you cannot really play the best lines anymore. Chess engines have demonstrated that all mainstream openings, and even many strange lines, should eventually result in a draw. GM Anish Giri explains that the stronger the engine gets, the more it shows that variations that were considered bad before are no longer bad because the engine is able to defend them. Even what used to be a dubious opening turns out to be playable if you defend accurately and the engine shows how to defend. So that's a quote from Giri. And then this next paragraph, what does this era of equality everywhere mean for chess openings? Engines have forced chess players to be more subtle in the opening, but haven't stopped them from aiming for a win. Check out the 5 major opening strategies in the engine age. As George Orwell might say, all openings are equal, but some are more equal than others. And then his first idea. So these are sort of ideas or strategies for opening play in the age of computer analysis. The first one he calls home field advantage. And I like this. And he basically says that if you're not going to achieve an advantage out of the opening, the next best option is to get a position that you know really well, but your opponent doesn't. So it's like home field advantage in sports. And as an example, he talks about Hikaru, how he uses 1b3 to open games, which immediately is going off book. Because again, the idea is that the quicker you get your opponents out of book and they have to think for themselves, the greater a mistake. But if it's an opening you know well, you'll have an advantage. So if you play 1b3 and you've studied that and you know all the ideas, well, you're going to have an advantage against a player who is not familiar with that, who doesn't have like a pet response for that. But the bottom line is you always want to steer the game into an opening that you do know. So for example, if your opponent does open with something a bit unconventional, try to play moves that will transpose it into an opening that you do know. It's not always easy, but it's something you want to try to do. Because if you're familiar with the opening, or if you have a better idea of the position rather than your opponent earlier in the game, you're going to be in good shape. The next thing he mentions, the next idea, is called one-time tricks. And what he's saying here, and this is something that we've spoken about on the pod as well, and I think this is very important. By one-time tricks, he's saying that it's not always best or even correct that the move you play is the objectively best move. Because there might be a more inferior move or a move that's not quite as good, but it's actually a better move because it forces your opponent to think, or it tricks your opponent, or he's not sure of the response. So for example, let's say you play the best engine move, but if it's a very straightforward move and your opponent's response is forced or is very simple, what are you really gaining? I mean, yeah, of course you always want to aim for the best move, but there might be another move that is not objectively best, but it messes with your opponent's head or can induce a mistake more than the correct move. And I think at our level, that is especially correct because most of the blunders happen when players get confused and they're not sure what to do. They either panic or they get impatient or they don't analyze and they just whip something out and it's a mistake. So of course, anytime you can make a move that really forces your opponent to think, anytime you make a move that's not obvious, where the answer isn't obvious, they might blunder. So here's what he says. I'm just going to read the first sentence from this section. He says, even in the computer era, not every move needs to be objectively good. your opponent can't access engines during a game, so a dangerous surprise might score better than the quote-unquote right move. The third idea is what he calls memory tests. And this is where you play an opening where you're forcing your opponent to find the only move available. In other words, you play positions where if this one move isn't played, you could be winning. So here's what he says. Just because there's a way for black to equalize in every opening, it doesn't mean that your opponent will have studied the details or be able to remember them in the critical moment. A common strategy at the top level is to try a sharp opening where the opponent can draw with best play and must find a series of only moves to get there. And then he gives an example. GM Alexander Predke, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, chose a dynamic line of the English against his higher rated opponent. Black only made one major mistake, missing a key idea on move 15, but that was enough to cost him the game. Chess is so complicated that even an opening expert like GM Max Vachir-Lagrave can't remember everything. So bringing this to the amateur level, basically, if you play a sharp opening where there's positions where your opponent only has one correct response, that's certainly a good thing because they can easily go wrong. And that's the general strategy against beating a higher rated opponent is you kind of need to create an unbalanced, almost wild position out of the gate. It's kind of like that old Tal quote. You want to create like the thick forest where neither of you knows, I'm butchering the quote, but you get the idea. The next idea, and this is a little bit similar to the previous one, is just get them thinking. And here's what he says. When you're a stronger player than your opponent, you only need a way to get your opponent thinking without computer assistance to have great winning chances. No one is as strong as Carlsen, so he will frequently try a small surprise in the opening to get the opponent out of preparation. And these little novelties don't dramatically change the game. They just have to keep enough pieces on the board to let you challenge your opponent over many moves. So basically, and this is clearly becoming a theme in this article, any move that really gets your opponent thinking, that creates a strategically rich position where the correct plan is not clear, those types of positions can easily induce a mistake. As a simple example, if you're playing a book opening that's very straightforward, well, you're not really getting your opponent to think because if they know the opening, they're just going to play the book moves. But if you mix things up right away and they have to think on their own, you have a much greater chance of them making a mistake. We're now going to take one more short break, and then we will continue discussing this article about chess openings in the engine era. So this final idea he calls, is it really equal? And I will say up front, my one, I don't want to say criticism here, but my one critique here, this one definitely applies more to the pros than the amateur level. So he talks about the fact that Stockfish evaluates, let me just read the quote, I think it's better that way. So he says, the engine Stockfish evaluates the starting position at around 0.33 in White's favor. Although that advantage shouldn't be quite enough to win the game against perfect defense, it doesn't mean that Black has an easy life. Some players still try to milk that tiny advantage for all it's worth by playing the absolute engine-approved best moves. If the opponent makes a minute error, that 0.33 can grow pretty quickly. Now, I'll say this, and this is going back to a comment I made when I first started this podcast. I haven't said this in a while, so I'm happy to say it again because I feel strongly about it. The idea that you have an advantage with the white pieces at our level is utter nonsense. I will argue that with everybody, and the reason is, as he said, it's 0.33, which as far as two humans is nothing. It's very, very slight, but because at our level, the games are riddled with mistakes and inaccuracies. It could be gross mistakes. It could be subtle mistakes. But we can all agree, amateur games are riddled with mistakes. That 0.33 pawn unit advantage is meaningless. It's completely obliterated. One of the things that drives me bonkers at the club is I'll put the pairings up and I'll see someone say, oh, goody, I'm white. Oh, cool, I'm white. Or, yeah, I'm white against you. Thank goodness. And that drives me crazy. And, you don't have an advantage with the white pieces. Many amateur players, that is, are more comfortable with the white pieces because most people don't study their openings with black enough. But the idea that you have this massive advantage at the amateur level as white is utter nonsense. Now, of course, when two grandmasters are facing each other, which is kind of what he's leaning towards here, that's a different story. That could mean something, but even some would argue that in today's day and age, even at the highest level, white doesn't have as much of an advantage as people think, but that's a separate argument that I'm not going to get into. Also, the idea that, well, you should always play for the win as white, and with black, you should play for the draw, that type of thing, that's really for the pros. It doesn't matter which color you get. At our level, whether you have the black pieces or the white pieces, you should always play for the win. So then he concludes the article by saying that engines have demonstrated that both sides are okay in almost every opening. So basically, even with these somewhat unconventional openings, there are resources. Now, of course, the engine's going to show it easily, but for us humans, it may be more difficult to figure out. So an interesting article. Again, I linked it up. Now, the one thing, though, which I probably should have said in the beginning, if you're just starting out, this might be a little too complicated of a philosophy, and this article also seems to be biased towards top players. I think at the amateur level, you can pretty much play any opening you want as long as you're getting playable middle games. That's the goal. And some of what he says goes against my own belief because I'm more of a fan of stick to the same openings, play the openings that you know. System openings are good. And when you have a set opening repertoire, you will generally get into less trouble. But I do agree with him that technically you should mix it up every now and then, especially against an opponent who's really booked up. But my take is this, because there's two ways to look at it. If you try to mix things up from the beginning and create a position where both you and your opponent aren't sure what to do, that can be a good thing, especially against a high-rated player. But when you play the openings that you know, even if your opponent prepped for that, you could still be in good shape. In other words, that's my philosophy. So if someone has the black pieces against me and I play the London and they know I play the London and they prepped for it, well, here's the thing. Even if they prepped for that, I'm still okay because when you play an opening that you know so well, you can deal with your opponent's prep because you've seen just about everything that your opponent can throw at you. Now, the philosophy that's out there, and this is in Chess for Tigers, a lot of coaches believe in this philosophy, which is that for openings, you should treat lower-rated players different from higher-rated players. So the idea is that against a lower-rated player, and not just for the opening, but the game in general, don't try anything fancy. Just play straightforward ABC chess. And because they're lower-rated, they will make a mistake at some point. They might hold their own for a while. They might even play a little bit better than you. We spoke about this in last week's episode, The Survival Guide to Competitive Chess, that book by John Ems. He says this in there as well. When you're playing a low-rated opponent, they're going to do well for a while. They might know they're opening well. They might even play slightly better than you for much of the game, but eventually they're going to drop the ball. It might be sooner or later, but they will drop the ball. So against the low-rated, you just play ABC chess, play straightforward. You don't need to push anything or look for complicated tactics. They'll eventually drop the ball. And then the idea is against high-rated opponents, you do not want to play straightforward ABC chess because if you play typical theoretical lines and just straightforward chess, the idea is that the high-rated player is going to know those positions so well and they're just going to outplay you, right? If you try to just play standard, straightforward chess, quote unquote, the high-rated player, he's just going to know all that stuff better than you, and you're just going to end up losing. So the thinking is against a high-rated opponent, you want to get him or her out of book as soon as possible. You want a position where neither of you is sure what to do, and then that's where the mistakes come. But of course, it's double-edged because for many low-rated players, the fact that they don't know the position too well, they might be more likely to make a mistake more than their high-rated opponent. And I don't necessarily agree that all the time you need to do that. I've played high-rated players where I've played straightforward chess, I've played my standard openings, and I've drawn or beaten them. So that's not always the case. It's certainly a legitimate philosophy, but I know many times where I've tried to mix it up against a higher rated opponent, I end up getting in trouble. And in some cases, I'll get crushed pretty early. So it really depends. One of the advantages of playing at the club level each week is that you kind of know your opponents and what to expect. Like at our club, there's certain higher rated players where I'm going to have to mix it up or I have no chance, where they're so strong, I'm statistically so likely to lose that I have to sort of go for it, so to speak. I have to mix it up. Where there are other higher rated players at the club where I can play straightforward ABC chess, just play very solidly, and I can do very well. So it really depends. Obviously, if you're going into a weekend tournament cold and you don't know your opponent, you're going to have to make a decision. The reason I mention that, I think this article has some interesting ideas, but I think it's really geared toward stronger players. So if you're playing, let's say, an opponent who's rated 1,000 and you're rated 1,000 yourself, let's say you have two beginners or advanced beginners, you can play pretty much any opening you want, because at that level, it doesn't matter. At that level, it's going to be a battle of mistakes. As you get a little bit stronger, the opening becomes more important. And then the goal, of course, with any opening, let's not get into this. You want to play for an advantage as white or a draw as black. You want to equalize. The goal of any opening at our level, regardless of which color you have, is to get a playable middle game. Period. End of discussion. You've heard me say that 1,000 times. So when you develop your opening repertoire, if you're getting middle games where on a regular basis you're equal, slightly better, or much better, then your opening repertoire is good. But where I do agree with this article, it's good to mix it up once in a while. Like I'm a London player. Sometimes I'll throw in the Jababa. For the French defense, there's a few subtleties I'll sometimes use that are a little off book. Even when I open with D4, there's a couple of things I'll try that aren't quite a London system. Once in a while, I'm not going to say what it is. 99% of the time, I'm playing either a mainline London or a Jababa. But I'll conclude by saying this. You do want to develop your own opening repertoire with both the white pieces and the black pieces. You don't want a situation where you feel uncomfortable because you have the black pieces. And a lot of people are in that situation. That's not a place you want to be in. You want to feel confident regardless of which color you have. And if having the black pieces somehow makes you uncomfortable, or if you feel you have a disadvantage, well, you need to work on your openings with the black pieces, because that's important. Now, this took a long time to develop, but for me, I'm cool whatever color I play. I'm comfortable either way. And it's funny, in some ways, I almost like having the black pieces more, because I feel like I can dictate. Like if my opponent opens with E4, if I play E6, I'm the one who has the black pieces. I'm the one dictating the opening. I'm saying we're playing the French, right? If my opponent opens with D4 and I play knight F6, I'm saying I'm going to go into like an Indian type of defense. So if my opponent plays C4 and I play B6, let's say, or knight F6, and I go into a Nimzo English, we were talking about this at the club this week. In some ways, you almost have not more control, but you have a certain amount of control as black as to which opening white's going to play. One other thing I'll say, don't just study the opening, because a lot of people, when they're starting out, they're just convinced that the key to success in chess is just openings, and they try to memorize lines, but then what happens is in the actual game, the opponent doesn't play those lines, and then they don't know what to do. So really just focus on not blundering on all your basic tactical ideas, basic positional ideas. Understand the game as a whole. You just can't study the opening as, let's say, 90% of your training, and then the rest is 10%. That's a common mistake that people make. But on the other hand, you can't not study the opening at all. So like when some people say, oh, when you're just starting out, or if you're lower rated, don't worry about the opening. Well, that's not true as well. You do need to have some opening knowledge. So very philosophical this week. Really appreciate you listening. As always, if you have a question or comment or a topic idea, email me, info@thechessangle.com. Once again, info@thechessangle.com. You can also go to our website and click the contact form there and leave a message. There's also a voicemail option, very easy to use. You just click that microphone icon. Those are always cool messages to get. Have a wonderful week, everybody, and I hope you win your next game.